We're back with another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Well, what we do on the show every Wednesday and every Friday is break down some of the daily evidence of the media's utter corruption. We're under absolutely no delusions that the media is redeemable at this point, to borrow a word from one of our favorite people in the world. And we're going to start off with just a beautiful example right now from CNN, courtesy, I should say, of CNN. Check this out. Here's a screenshot from one of their articles. I believe this was published yesterday. It's on the Kristi Noem dust-up. This is a literal sentence written from one of the purportedly objective news outlets. CNN, by the way, has one of the most popular news websites in the world. The orders also reference, quote, biological sex, a disputed term that refers to the sex as listed on students' original birth certificates. It's not possible to know a person's gender identity at birth, and there is no consensus criteria for assigning sex at birth. There is no consensus criteria for assigning sex at birth? I mean, Ben, it seems like it's pretty easy.
It's a disputed term for the party of science. It's hard to even know where to begin, except to say that this is a perfect example, and we're going to have another example of this coming up shortly, of perverting language to pervert the narrative, to force home your political prerogatives, and ultimately override common sense, human nature, the history of mankind, and just plain logic. It is truly remarkable, of course. You know, CNN, the moral relativists who, of course, but their morality is the sole morality, to try to redefine and somehow call into question the definition of sex. No, sex is sex. It's definitional. Scientists stand behind it. Human history stands behind it. The dictionary stands behind it. It's laughable that we even have to debate it. And maybe our side should start doing this too. Maybe we should start saying that every one of their terms is disputed. Yeah, social justice is disputed, what that means. We could run down the list, and maybe that's the only way that we're going to get past this, is to go to the reductio ad absurdum sort of form of argumentation, of push it to its logical conclusion, that nothing means anything in the left's world. And that's where we're going. But here, of course, there are real world consequences to this, obviously, because people end up, sometimes children, putting themselves in incredibly harmful positions psychologically and also literally physically, I would argue, as a consequence in part of this narrative that they are trying to drive home. And I'm not trying to be euphemistic here, but as Ryan Anderson talks about in his book, which is now verboten, I mean, you're talking about people literally misfiguring themselves who sometimes end up suicidal as a consequence of it. So once again, it's irresponsible of the media, it's reckless of the media, it's dishonest. And again, this abuse of language, abuse of power, it's perverting the language to drive home a narrative, to ultimately drive home political responses, solutions. But meanwhile, while they virtue signal over this, lives are hurt. And those consequences are never dealt with the media. And to go back to the Ryan Anderson point, maybe that's one of the reasons why Amazon had to nuke his book in the first place, because God forbid people actually see the truth of it.
Well, you know, this is, again, like, you're right, this is dangerous. It's one thing for me to think about, like, a progressive millennial believing this. It's an entirely different thing to then get that person a job at a news outlet. And then it's another thing for that person to publish a sentence like this in a news outlet like CNN, again, a purportedly neutral and objective news outlet with one of the biggest followings in the world, where they're doing this with the facade of neutrality and objectivity. It's another thing then for that to get past editors. So it's like actually just kind of an incredible sequence of events. Editors exist so that when your progressive millennial reporters file something that is like obviously glaringly ridiculous. I mean, maybe the editors put this in, we don't know. But either way, editors should catch this stuff and say, this is really bad. Like, this is not, forget about neutrality. This is just like anti-common sense, anti-reality, anti-science, et cetera, et cetera. It makes legitimately no sense whatsoever. So the fact that like it's one thing for somebody to sort of have kooky beliefs, even though we know that's becoming more and more mainstream because of academia and the way it's injecting all of those college graduates into the working world. But it's another thing entirely for this to get past like the authorities, for this to get past the editors at CNN. And it's an amazing glimpse into just how out of touch the journalistic class is from the rest of the country. I mean, there was a Morning Consult political poll that sort of like made waves in the Beltway a few weeks back when it found, I think we talked about it here, when it found that like a majority of people in the country did not support people competing in the sport that they were not biologically, with sex that they were not biologically born as. And even, I mean, it was even among Gen Z and millennials. Like it was an even split among Gen Z and millennials. And here in DC, where I am, most people are probably believe exactly the word jumble in that CNN article, but in the rest of the country, nobody believes it. And my goodness, they shouldn't, because it's absolutely nuts. It's just like, but again, the fact that this is treated as mainstream information is such a statement on how bad the media is. And we can't just keep like whistling past the graveyard. We can't just keep pretending that the media is getting things wrong and that they're in this sort of like, they're sort of left leaning and they probably mostly vote for Democrats. It's so far beyond that. They're completely drunk on the sort of like postmodernist, like you said, moral relativist ideology that everyone had implanted into their minds in higher education. Now they're in the working world. So I mean, I just look at stuff like this and I just think we're so far gone. We're so far gone. The media is so far gone.
CNN is drunk on wokeism, and I'd say it's a disputed neutral arbiter of news and fact. Yeah.
Right, yeah, apples and bananas. Like, but let's like they again. This is about how they present themselves, which I think gets to the media malfeasance. Is that they present themselves? They purposefully tell people we are neutral. We are telling you what an apple and a banana is. This is fact and reality. This is fact from fiction. And then they go on and do stuff like that. It's just incredible. I mean, it's incredible disrespect for their audience, and it's also just insane.
Let's move on to more insanity now.
Yeah, it gets better. So the next topic that we have is about the Associated Press sending a memo that was reported on this week, and I'm going to put some screenshots up here. They're really, really crazy too. So this is a memo from the top brass at the Associated Press saying that the reporter should not be referring to the border crisis as a crisis. You can see right there that bolded sentence. We should avoid, or at the least, be highly cautious about referring to the present situation as a crisis on our own, although we may quote others using that language. This was obtained by Julio Ricardo Varela, and he has another screenshot here. There's a particular sentence that stands out to me. The new U.S. policy under Biden has been not to deport back minor children because of unsafe conditions for them in Mexico. Oh my gosh. Biden is contending with the largest number of migrant encounters at the border since a 4-month streak in 2019. Okay, that right there, that's it. Now look, this is how they used the word crisis during the Trump administration. I mean, just take a look at that visual. It's remarkable when you juxtapose it with the memos. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. What are your thoughts on this, Ben?
I'm also just thinking back to how every week, pretty much maybe every hour, every minute, there was a bombshell in the Trump administration that ultimately proved a dud. So when conservative media pounces and seizes with bombshell claims about the Biden administration, is AP going to put out a fact check or a redefinition saying we cannot use bombshell in these scenarios? It just simply does not reflect the facts on the ground. I mean, look, let's just be very honest and straightforward and open about what's happening here. They're not barring the use of crisis because they actually think the situation merits barring the use of crisis. This is politics. It's politics pure and simple. Let's just call it out. I mean, we have to drop all the pretense that these are neutral arbiters. Like we said, that's a disputed claim that they're neutral arbiters. Let's call everything that they say disputed. Of course it's a crisis. We have these facilities that are overrun. You have people coming over with the coronavirus. We now see, just to add one little asinine tangential point to this, that San Diego teachers are actually teaching migrant students in person while students in the district are still learning remote. And this is absolute insanity. And the administration's response is basically to blame it on President Trump. And then when they're not doing that, to say, well, basically, this is a seasonal thing. I heard Mrs. Jacobson saying that in one clip. And beyond the fact that it's seasonal, basically that people should turn around and go back home. That's essentially been the response. And of course, as we covered, Yamiche Alcindor attributed this all to President Biden being the most moral, virtuous person in the world. And because of his kindness, his generosity, that's why we have a rush of the border. It's an obvious crisis. It's a crisis because they're taking questions about it. They can't just skirt it and say fake news. It's just the right-wing media getting all stirred up. It's obvious that that's not the case. They have a brewing crisis on their hands, and it, by the way, because as we've seen, the administration blocked Ted Cruz or Ted Cruz's staff from being able to examine some of the facilities where the migrants are being held, which, of course, under the past administration, this would have been a brazen assault on transparency and openness, an authoritarian act not to show the kids in the cages. It's so obvious and apparent here what's going on. And it's that as a consequence of open borders policies that incentivize this has been what happens. It's a magnet for illegality. It's a magnet for the erosion of our sovereignty. And I know this is a media criticism show. It's not a political show. But when the media is being brazenly political like this, it demands a response on the merits of the situation. And it's so clear here what AP is doing. And it's that they don't want to grapple with the merits. So they just redefine the term and actually censor the term, essentially.
Yeah. And again, what's so strange to me, I mean, it's not strange, it's just completely unfortunate, is how the border in and of itself is used by the media. You see them. It's funny because the AP is saying, we need to be careful with the word crisis because we don't want to use language that misconstrues the situation. But the media will turn the border into a crisis. They will take, whenever they are, they see something and it fits into their anti-conservative, anti-Republican narrative, they are easily persuaded to call it a crisis. And that's exactly what we see right here. And it's funny because they don't, I wrote this in a piece last week. Fish don't know they're wet, and media leftists don't totally understand their bias. They don't fully understand their own bias because they're so drunk on these narratives that they don't think totally clearly. They don't have the ability. They have blinders on, and they don't have the ability to see that when they're calling it a crisis under Trump and then sending memos saying it's not a crisis under Biden, they're sort of over rationalizing it and justifying it and thinking about it in their own heads. But it's just so blatant. It's completely black and white that when you have two situations, you decide to call one a crisis and another not. It's just so obvious. But it's one of those things that when you're so blinded by your own bias, you can't possibly notice it. They're in so deep that they don't notice how biased they are. And this is just one word that we happen to get the memo on, literally get the memo on. It's amazing how they use language to drive news cycles, to drive policy, to drive culture. We just talked about CNN. That's them driving culture. It's also them driving science, because when you talk about things in those terms, doctors are afraid to, not offer those types of treatment they may disagree with, or to, say something that might oppose it, because they're afraid of the consequences of being called hateful, et cetera, et cetera. So they drive our culture this way. They drive our politics. They drive our policy. They drive everything. And sometimes it's as simple as just a little word that they decide to use once and not again.
Yeah, since you talk about the drunkenness on narratives, the slavish devotion to narratives, maybe I can help segue into what our final segment is going to be on, which is in last week's episode on Friday, we talked a little bit about the contrast between the Boulder, Colorado shooting and the shooting in the Atlanta area of Georgia, and how basically, in the latter case, the narrative is there's this spiraling rise in anti-Asian hate in America, of course, brought on by the bad orange man who dared to call the coronavirus crisis by its rightful name. And so we're seeing this massive scourge of anti-Asian hatred around the country, of course, perpetrated by white supremacists, we know. Except when you actually look into the facts, the demographic breakdown shows that it's pretty much an even split between blacks and whites, and then another split among minorities when it comes to anti-Asian hate crimes. And you also look at the numbers and you see that while on a percentage basis, yes, there's been a spike, we're talking from minuscule levels, mercifully, to just slightly larger minuscule levels of attacks on Asians. You can't necessarily tie the attacks to actually being targeted attacks on Asians specifically versus just attacks themselves. And we can run through the whole litany, but there's also, beyond the dishonesty of that narrative, there's also the obfuscating from the much bigger narrative that might be relevant, which is that there's been a massive explosion in violent crime everywhere across the country over the last years. Huge percentage increases in murders across the country, in violent crimes across the country, in cities across the country, regardless of their demographics. So could it be that maybe this anti-Asian crime wave is a part of this broader crime wave that we're seeing across the country? And could it possibly be that we're seeing this broader crime wave across the country, besides the fact that we locked everyone down for months on end, in no small part thanks to the media-enabled hysteria, but also as a consequence of the fact that there was an encouragement, essentially, of violence, a subsidization by providing bail, like our Vice President of the United States going out there and saying, you know what, we should provide bail to the 1619 rioters, and that no one was punished for those crimes. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox because, again, I don't want to go too much into the politics here. But there's the media angle of it, which is that they not only frame narratives dishonestly, but then they also ignore data points that might suggest that the reality, not the narrative, might be different from what they're putting forth. And the reason I say there's a segue here is because there's been an attempt from the start, I would say, to try to, first, when they moved to the racism narrative in terms of castigating the Chinese Communist Party for its complicity in the coronavirus crisis, the media glommed onto that narrative from the very beginning. And the Biden administration, one of its first acts was to completely bar the executive branch from using the term China virus or Chinese coronavirus or Wuhan flu or any of those terms. All of that terminology deemed racist, xenophobic, hateful, etc. So you can't call the virus by its name, which means you can't ascribe it to the party most culpable in its spread. And then, of course, the other act that they took, unlike the Trump administration, was to say we're going to go back into the World Health Organization. The Chinese Communist Party controlled World Health Organization from the man on top, Dr. Tedros, who is China's man running the WHO, and which ran interference for China from the very start of the crisis in terms of no human-to-human transmission and a whole litany of other issues associated with it. This is not a pandemic, then it is a pandemic. China's doing a good job. Everyone should follow China's policy in association with it, et cetera, et cetera. From the start, the media has started to chip away, or at least distract us from the fact that China is most culpable in this crisis. And the Biden administration itself, by the way, has not vowed to hold China to account. And again, by going back into the WHO, it conferred legitimacy on that CCP-controlled organization. One of the central narratives that the Chinese Communist Party holds to and that our media has propagated ad nauseum for months is the idea that this virus did not emanate from a Wuhan lab where they were doing all sorts of tests on coronaviruses and other viruses, incidentally. And incidentally, that the PLA, the military, also did work at that lab, or the lab did work in conjunction with the military. And of course, anyone who dared to raise this point that perhaps there was an accident from the lab, or maybe something much more nefarious, which there's of course less evidence for because this is a communist-controlled country, the media always has dismissed as conspiracy theorists anyone who would dare question, could it possibly be that this wet market a couple hundred feet away might actually be from the lab, might be the convenient excuse for the fact that actually it is probable, it's likely, possible at least, that maybe this was a lab that did not have the right protections in place from the coronavirus? No, the media will not even entertain that narrative. They won't do the research on it. When the Trump administration, right before it left, put out reporting from the State Department indicating that there was evidence of it, the media basically excused it. There's been a deny effort basically the entire time. And we could go through a much broader, we could spend a whole episode or multiple episodes talking about the media glomming on to the Chinese Communist Party's narratives, including the narrative of anti-Asian hate in America, which the Chinese Communist Party English language mouthpieces love to propagate as well, just like they love to propagate in the faces of American diplomats, the fact that America has problems with race and human rights when the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest human rights violator in the world. There's a perfect article about this by Stephen Miller. I know, a long windup into this piece in The Spectator, where he talks about the fact that logic, reason, those in the intelligence community, many others agree that it's probable that this was an accident or worse coming from the lab in Wuhan. But the media, along with the World Health Organization, along with the Chinese Communist Party controlled mouthpieces and the party itself, are all devoted to shooting down this narrative. And the WHO, we know, went through this whole sham kabuki exercise and came out and essentially said, it's pretty unlikely that it was passed from a lab. We stick with our original assessment. But then, of course, even the WHO now is admitting this really wasn't a rigorous enough process and we need to look into it further. And maybe it won't be a completely Chinese Communist Party controlled process. So once again, when the president talked about the enemy of the people with the media, that really rankled the media, and it played into their whole narrative of authoritarian. He wants to take us down, etc. But what happens when the media is siding with a hostile adversary against the United States here and essentially running cover for the malign, adversarial, most evil regime that we face in the world? That's exactly what we're seeing when they glom onto the Chinese Communist Party's favored narrative about the coronavirus. And it does great damage to our credibility, to our standing, and to whatever confrontation we're ultimately going to have. And we should be engaged in right now with the CCP that's been engaged in one against the U.S. for decades. So once again, I will get off my soapbox here and turn it over to you. But it's enraging to me how our media loves to side with the Chinese Communist Party, to say nothing, of course, of the CCP's own dollars that go into these organizations.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also just, so the World Health Organization report obviously was released yesterday, and that was a report that was basically put together by China. It was essentially, the report was essentially written by China, and we've seen that China has undue influence over the World Health Organization throughout this pandemic. It's a very tricky spot for the World Health Organization, obviously, to be in. That doesn't really excuse any propagandizing on behalf of the CCP, even if it's just to sort of keep the peace and maintain a balance as best they can. I think it shows some of the very fundamental problems with organizations like the World Health Organization, period. But just to the media element here, Frontline had a really good dive into how China covered up the rise of the coronavirus. This is from PBS. And it's really, really interesting because they interview a New York Times reporter who looks back on her own coverage and wonders, oh my gosh, was I too sympathetic to the CCP early on in the pandemic when I was repeating lines, or I was sort of giving credulity to, their own, or credibility, I should say, to their own lines and their own propaganda. I should have known that there was more skepticism. And it's weird because the lesson doesn't seem to be learned. There was a long New York Magazine essay, I think published just a couple months ago about, I think it was just called The Lab Theory. And in this long article, it sort of discussed how the lab theory is pretty legitimate. It's not conclusive. There isn't a ton of hard evidence because, as you say, we're dealing with a, communist country that has in its best interest shutting down access to all of this information. But this New York Magazine article got into all this, and it's kind of infuriating because there were so many people in conservative media and on the right who were being called racist for conspiracists, basically. Basically, there's conspiracy-addled rubes for raising questions about that lab, even though there were a lot of red flags about that lab early on. And it seemed like the media was finally sort of getting the memo on the lab when the New York Magazine essay came out. But I honestly think so many journalists in DC and New York, wherever, I mean this. I think they actually only read their own peers. So they're only reading the Times, the Post, the LA Times, et cetera, et cetera. I, honest to goodness, don't think they know the story here. But I think what happens is they hear reporters they trust, like the New York Times reporter who regrets her own coverage. They hear that information and they see it in so many different places. We talked about a story just last week or the week before on the show where all of these different corporate media outlets confirmed the same story because they got the same bad information. And so when you're consuming all of the same bad information as though it's fact and sort of indisputed fact, then you like genuinely are out of touch with reality. And so I just think they like really, really honestly don't know the evidence, and they don't even realize that they need to look harder for it. And they're going about their jobs misinforming everybody because everything that they do is predicated on a false narrative.
Yeah, it's a really bad game of telephone with horrendous consequences for the country. I mean, there's another aspect of this, which is, of course, if someone like Senator Tom Cotton says it, it must be a conspiracy and false. So you have that angle. And then there's something broader, and we haven't really touched on it that often because probably rightly, a lot of the foreign policy and national security stuff is inside baseball and not immediately apparent why it's relevant to all of the country as opposed to the people who are focused on those sorts of issues. But there has been a temptation among those in our media dating back to the throes of the Cold War to romanticize our worst adversaries. And to be fair, there are, including the New York Times and several others, and probably even more so to the extent they've now been kicked out of mainland China, so they're kind of able to snipe back at them by doing so. There is some real investigative journalism done and true reportage done on the horrors of living under one of these regimes, of the malign efforts that they undertake around the world. And I think it's in part because it's been experienced by the publications. Again, I think the cynical political aspect is this regime punished us, so we're going to fight back against it. But more broadly than that, there's a temptation, particularly among progressives, widespread, and then among the media in particular, to, again, sort of assume the best of these regimes. They always like to create this foil of, well, there are moderates and hardliners within these regimes, instead of just accepting the fact the regime is the regime. Here are its principles, here are its practices, and we have to keep that in mind whenever we're assessing whatever it does. When it comes to communist China, I think they get that it's an adversary, or at least a extreme competitor, as the administration might call it. It's just I'm tired of the euphemism. I'm just beside myself with it. Just call things by their name, but of course they can't do that because calling things by their name is admitting truth, and they can't admit truth. They have to have narrative to supplant the truth. But I do think it's worth emphasizing and underlining this point, that there is just this tendency among progressives to mirror image, to assume that every single regime on earth is just like the American government, or every single people is just like Americans, instead of respecting the fact that actually, look, there is diversity. Different cultures are different. Different regimes have different ideas, and they hold different things dear. They operate differently in the same situation as you might find yourself. And you ought to take them at their word when they tell you that this is a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship, and then, suppresses hundreds of millions of people across the country. Take it at its word. But instead, we again go back to this idealizing, romanticizing the regimes. And I think that's in part why there's this covering for the CCP, beyond, as I mentioned, that cynical element. And there's been some good reporting done on this, of the fact that you have Chinese Communist Party effectively paying these publications to put in inserts from China's own publications. And of course, the fact that some of these publications want to have access to China, so consequently, they're going to kowtow to it. And again, that is basically our media laundering an adversary's narratives. That completely undermines the American national interest, and the media should be called out on it every single day of the week, because they do it all the time. And we'll keep focusing on that on bad news.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple really important points that I want to just zoom in on quickly. The first is that this is a good example of how the media's just very reflexive disdain for most of the right colors their coverage negatively, because they know that they sort of instinctively realize that when the right is saying something, they need to be on the other side of it. And it actually really makes them a lot worse at their jobs, because, for instance, Tom Cotton floating the lab theory months and months ago is what really informed them that it was crazy, right? That they needed to now believe that it was crazy. And so they didn't push, and they didn't, they made all of these assumptions that are in line basically with CCP propaganda, because they weren't interested they weren't sort of like open-minded enough to say, well, let's consider all possibilities. When one of the possibilities had been floated by a Republican senator, they dismiss as a sort of like MAGA crazy person. And so that's just like a good example to me of something that happens all of the time. And I think you make a good point also about access to China. When you have a country that is so stringent, basically, in order to have any access to China whatsoever, you have to do their bidding sometimes. You have to, because you have, like, their version of fair reporting is dramatically different than what our version of fair reporting on China is in the United States. And so to have access to that country, it's really difficult, right? Like you have to sort of like, you can't be totally skeptical of absolutely every single thing that they do, because they'll just shut you down completely and you'll never be able to do any reporting. So that's also a huge problem for corporate media. And that's like a pretty legitimate problem, but it doesn't, excuse any reporting that, boosts an evil regime no matter what. There's just plainly no excuse for that. While the problem may be understandable and legitimate, there's just no excuse for that, because this is a regime that is hurting its own people en masse.
And this is one of the challenges of having a free and open society, relatively at least. I mean, increasingly less so, and increasingly, by the way, of course, trying to mimic all of communist China's worst sort of practices, like a coronavirus passport and locking ourselves down and all the other Orwellian social credit system like stuff and our anti-cultural revolution. But leave that aside, at least on paper, this is a challenge of a free and open society versus a closed adversarial society. And one would hope that our media would serve as freedom fighters, as the front line of defense, exposing the corruption of the adversary, exposing its evil and malign acts. But instead we see here, once again, it's actually serving as one of its mouthpieces. And once again, it's just devastating for the country. But we will continue to expose it on Bad News every single week.
That's right. We're here every Wednesday and Friday. If you tune into the Federalist social media channels around 10:30 in the morning, that's about when we go live. We're trying to bring you the best stories that are evidence of the media's corruption, so that we can highlight them and better understand exactly how misinformed they are rendering the public. We appreciate your time. We're a project of the Federalists and the National Journalism Center. I am Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
We'll be back on Friday with more. Please stay tuned to Bad News.